It's a big, bold statement, and it suggests that in fact one of the key video transport systems used across the industry today is about to become no more. In this course, we'll hear from Gary Kayye, founder of the rAVE agency, tech futurist and market analyst of over 25 years. If anyone knows anything about the Pro AV market, it's this guy. Enjoy.
So my presentation today is about the concern that HDBaseT should have with regard to their future. I want to preface this with, first off, if you read any of the stuff that I write, you know that I'm not a big fan of HDBaseT. I'm going to explain to you why. And has nothing to do with AV over IP. It has to do with factors outside or unrelated to AV over IP. But I've had a problem. I think the platform was incredible when it was first launched, but there's been some holes in the system, in the platform and the ecosystem, I guess you'd call it, since it was launched. So I want to talk to you about that and sort of how AV over IP could solve, specifically SDVoE, could solve some of those problems in the long term. So to give you an idea, just make sure everyone knows who I am. My name is Gary Kayye. You may know us from the publication rAVE. We have 7 different publications that cover different vertical markets in the AV industry. We have a digital signage publication, an end-user oriented publication for those of you who might be end users that might be here, called Buyers Club. We have a House of Worship, a rental staging publication, a commercial AV publication, education publication. I also own a creative agency that does work specifically in the AV industry. And I do a lot of writing, and I've grown up in this industry and been in this industry for 32 years. So I have a passion not only for the technology that we produce in this industry. I think we're at the very pinnacle of technology. I think if you put technology in a triangle, with CES being down here at the bottom, the base of the industry, we're right there at the top. Everything we do trickles down to the consumer eventually. Stuff that you see here at our show will be in the consumer market 2 to 5 to maybe even possibly 10 years later. First place I ever saw HD, first place I ever saw 4K, first place I ever saw digital video signals. I mean, so this is a great industry. So I want you to understand that I have a love for the industry, but I also have a frustration, and I write about this a lot, when specific brands or companies will push a technology to its limits and then not support it ultimately long term. It hurts the industry, and that's what I feel about basically what's happened with HDBaseT, because I think it has a lot of potential. So you have 2 competing platforms, and a lot of you may not in your mind actually put these 2 together, even look at them as competing platforms. You may look at one as sort of like a simpler way of doing signal routing and distribution versus using HDMI or RGB-HV. You remember the days we used to do RGB-HV, versus an AV over IP way. And it's true, they are definitely different systems and different ways of distributing signals, because in the case of SDVoE, we're doing high bandwidth across the network. In the case of HDBaseT, we're converting it to a Cat5 wire so that we can simplify signal routing and distribution. In reality, HDBaseT is sort of a bridge to the future of our industry. And it has served as a bridge, certainly in the last 4 or 5 years. We've gone from HDMI and RGB distribution to HDBaseT as a very large portion of our signal routing and distribution segment of the market. In fact, you have a lot of the projector companies here who have added HDBaseT inputs on their projectors. So the eventual direction our industry will go, and I think that's clear to everyone, AV over IP, where we'll send everything across the network. The advantage of sending everything across the network is that once it's on the network, you can pull it off with depending on what kind of decoder you have, you can pull it off anywhere you want it to go. The vision and the future of our industry is going to be like that, in the sense that we'll put content on the network, regardless of what encoder you might use, whether it's SDVoE or somebody else's. Once it's on the network, the decoding device that actually shows the content could be anything one day. So for example, one day you could just go to your desktop, type in a URL, and the content from wherever it's being sent would show up on your laptop. Right now, here in the booth here and along the show floor, what everybody's showing is decoders, hardware boxes that decode and convert back to HDMI so you can display that content anywhere. But what I want you to do is not think of the future of AV over IP that way. That's actually not the direction it's going to go. The future of AV over IP is once we put it on the network, we can pull it off anywhere we want to pull it off at any moment in time. More closely resembles, or an analogy of that industry will be the way the digital signage market works now. You have digital signs all over the place. They could be in airports in London, they could be in airports in New York, or they could be in an office building in Brazil, and I can send the content to those displays regardless of what media player they have. And for that matter, I could pull the content onto a laptop screen or onto my cell phone if I wanted to, because it's on the network. So I want you to think about it that way, that the future is really going to be putting that content. So therefore, if you think about it that way, you know that this has to be a bridge to the future, in the sense that this is not the future of the industry, because we're going to ultimately, this doesn't stick it on the network and allow you to pull it off. This is a point-to-point distribution methodology. So it was great conceptually. And when HDBaseT came out, if you will Google HDBaseT in my name, you'll find that I was the biggest and first vocal supporter of the format, the platform, the quote-unquote standard in the entire industry. No one was writing about it. The HDBaseT Alliance was, or before they even formed the Alliance, Valens, the company that created it, was thanking me for writing about it. 2 years into the quote-unquote standard, and I put the, and that's supposed to be the word what, not hat, exactly what. HDBaseT had the perfect opportunity. HDBaseT delivered exactly what we wanted and needed at the time when it was launched about 10 years ago. But the standard, and I put the word standard in quotes because for those of you who are picky on these types of terminologies, you're exactly correct. HDBaseT is not a standard because we don't have a standards body that went and adopted it and said that we anoint you the standard for the industry in the way that we distribute signals across Cat5. But as you know, you've got about, 25 or 30 manufacturers, signal routing and distribution manufacturers. You've got 10 to 15 display companies that are integrating HDBaseT. So I don't know what else you need to become a standard. If you've got everybody using it, then ultimately you have to anoint this as a standard. So that's why I put it in quotation marks. However, where the problems happened wasn't at the beginning, it was in the middle. They had an incredible opportunity, but they didn't police it or manage it. What do I mean by that? So HDBaseT was based on this concept of 5-play. Okay, where you're sending 5 different signals down the cable. Anybody know what they are? Do you remember what they were? You got video, right? Audio. What else? Ethernet, power, and data. All right, so control, for example, would be an example of that. So therefore, but the problem is that they allowed all the HDBaseT adopters to design whatever they wanted. So they did not require them all to do all 5. So you might buy one transmitter that had all 5, and the receiver would only have 2. So I coined that as 4-play, 3-play, and 2-play. Of course, they didn't like that when I wrote that article. Because the problem was you'd have a transmitter that had all 5 signals and a receiver that had 2, or worse yet, a receiver that had 2 that put the voltage on a different pin or on a different place on the connector than the transmitter did. And I was actually at a location one time where we plugged in a receiver into a Panasonic projector, one of the first Panasonic projectors at HDBaseT, and fried the input. So because you don't have standards, although you have a quote standard in the way that signals are sent in 5-play, meaning not everyone was required to follow this concept, it basically became the Wild West. No one's gazentas was compatible with anyone else's goes-outas. So the inputs and outputs weren't compatible. So what you end up having is a transmission standard where you have to use different inputs and outputs, or where you can't use different input and outputs from different product manufacturers. You have to stay within one manufacturer's system. So, for example, you can't use an Extron transmitter with a Crestron receiver and so on and so forth, which is fine, and I'm perfectly fine with that, is if when they launched HDBaseT, they would have said this is what it was going to be. But when it was originally launched, that's not what they said it was going to be. They said it was going to be one standard sort of way of doing signal routing and distribution. And I think that it just kind of got out of hand. They did, a couple of years after I wrote that article, create a database online where you could go and search and see whose products were compatible, which ones did 5-play versus 4-play, they didn't call it that, and so on and so forth. But the damage, and quote unquote damage, had already been done, and as far as I'm concerned, because they didn't police the standard. Now, granted, maybe they would respond, and if they were here, they would say, look, that's not our job to police the standards. It's the job of the integrator to decide what they're going to use, and the advantage of what we're doing is it allows all of our adopters to do whatever they want to do. And I'm fine with that, except you sort of have to publish disclaimers with everything if that's the case, because the problem is the consumer. The consumer is not educated enough to know. The integrator certainly is, but the consumer is not educated enough to know when something isn't going to work with something else. When you see something labeled one way, right? So imagine if you have an iPhone and you see a cable labeled as USB to Lightning, you expect it to be able to plug in the iPhone and work because it's a lightning cable on one side and then the USB on the other. Imagine if you did that and you weren't sure if it was going to work. You were buying a USB to lightning cable, but you weren't sure it was actually going to work until you plugged it in. That's kind of what it's like from the consumer standpoint. And in our world now, 10 years later, consumers drive a lot of the business. And in a lot of cases, the consumers are ultimately fixing these problems in the field and experiencing themselves before the integrator actually finds out these problems exist. So again, had they just stuck to what they said they were going to do, I think everything would have been fine. So the reason why I made this, came up with this presentation is it's the differentiation between what HDBaseT Alliance is doing and the SDVoE Alliance is doing. Now, granted, they're not the same. They're not competitive standards. But I want to give kudos, although I'm not endorsing the SDVoE Alliance product, because I'm a big fan of AV over IP in general. I think SDVoE has one platform for AV over IP that's incredible. I do want to give kudos and attribute them with actually not only creating a quote-unquote standard, but actually policing the standard. So when you build SDVoE products, they all have to be interoperable with each other, and that's the key word, interoperability. We don't have to worry about a standard as long as there's interoperability. And if a manufacturer, as you know, for example, Crestron doesn't want to follow SDVoE and want to do their own thing, fine. That's perfectly fine with them. But if you're SDVoE and you're adopting SDVoE, you need to follow a certain path, and you need to follow a certain quote-unquote standard way of signal routing and distribution, sending the signals, and so the transmitters and receivers, or encoders and decoders in this case, will be compatible with each other. At least we know what we're getting, right? So if you decide you want to go with a non-SDVoE product, you know what you're getting, as opposed to assuming that everyone is playing nicely together. So in the case of SDVoE, you do have 100% interoperability, which means you can use anybody's switches, and they're going to work together. They're going to play together. In this case, I use Netgear just because they were the first switch manufacturer to integrate SDVoE, but there's now 2 or 3 others that have come along. Again, is it a standard? Well, I think to date they have something like 42, 43 manufacturers, 45, okay, so it's apparently 3 more since the show started. 45 manufacturers that have adopted the SDVoE platform. So I don't know, how many more do you need before it becomes sort of a standard way of doing AV over IP? It's not the only way, but in itself it's sort of a standard by the fact that all the adopters are all playing nicely together. So you can use a ZV encoder with a DVI gear decoder. You can use a Netgear switch. These are 3 totally different, disparate manufacturers, and they all have different benefits and features. So for example, there's a little small company in Australia who I think makes incredible SDVoE products called iMag. And you may never know who this company is, but you know that if you buy that product, it's going to work with a ZV receiver or a decoder. So you don't have to. You're not tied to one company. And you might think, well, that's getting out of the ZV ecosystem. Why wouldn't I just stay in the ZV ecosystem? Because what if you have a giant job and ZV's having a delivery problem? They'll be thanking their competitive manufacturers for bailing them out. Because you know you've been in situations where you've got a multi-$100,000 installation being held up by one thing that still hasn't shipped, and you've got to figure out how to get away around that. So that's one example of how that would be helpful. But more importantly, from the end user standpoint, we know there's going to be interoperability, and that's really what I care about. Because as an end user comes to the show, imagine walking around seeing these 1,100 booths and having no idea who works with who and whose products are compatible whose products. Finally, I've used the terms ecosystem and interoperability sort of interchangeably here, and I want to make sure that you understand they're not totally interchangeable. Interoperability, when I talk about interoperability, I mean things working together that are not made by the same company. In the case of an ecosystem, you can build an ecosystem within a company's product line, or you can build an ecosystem within a family of products of companies that are working together to complement each other. Either one is fine with me. I'm a big fan of either one. And so if you decide you want to go with a specific company's ecosystem, as long as they're fully informing you of what it does and what it can't do, I'm a big fan. I'm not saying that we have to have interoperability as an entire industry, because I think the limitation of interoperability is sometimes you don't get as much innovation when you don't have the ability to go outside of a platform or a standard, right? And you remember back to the early days of VHS and Beta and some of the battles there. Those were all, remember that Betamax was a Sony standard. It was an ecosystem system formed by Sony, and at VHS was a Toshiba founded thing that they licensed for $1, and you know the history. Beta was a better quality product. VHS won because it was an open, welcoming kind of thing. Same thing happened with DivX versus DVD. Do you remember that in the early days of DivX, for those of you who might have followed the consumer market? So I would say, I'd close with, I think history could potentially repeat itself if we're not careful, but ultimately, people get to choose what they want to do. So you can choose to continue to use whatever you want to use, but I feel like as long as you're fully informed and you're making a fully informed decision, it's fair game. So I hope you found this somewhat helpful. I would encourage you to go to the SDVoE.org Alliance website, because they have some great education, but I also encourage you to go get educated by all the competitive products out there as well for the AV over IP product line, because there are a lot of different products and technologies out here, and you should fully inform yourself about interoperability and ecosystem and make your own decisions for what's best for your organization, whether you're an integrator or a customer. Thank you very much.